Okay, I have 1:30, so I think we'll just go ahead and get started. There may be some more folks joining online. But just before we do a short reflection, I wanted to see if there were any questions that came up during the break or from this morning. Okay. All right, let's just do a short reflection. And what we're gonna do is review those disadvantages of anger. And we're going to do this as part of setting our motivation for the afternoon. So we won't spend a lot of time on this. I'd rather spend more time on some of the other practices that we have. But I think it is important that we review these at least. And this gives us the impetus to really want to do this work, to change our patterns, our habits, and adopt a more patient stance rather than continuing to proliferate our anger. So just find a comfortable posture. And as we did this morning, we'll just do a few minutes of watching the breath, bringing the mind to the breath, keeping it there as best as you can. When the mind wanders, gently guide the mind back to the breath. And by the way, I will answer some of the questions that were in the chat box when we resume with the teaching. So I'll ring the chime to begin the meditation. So now let's do this short reflection and begin by recalling that, as I explained earlier today, we're working with this diluted form of anger. There might be times when we feel a sort of righteous indignation at what's going on in our world that might be akin to anger, but it's not a diluted state when we want to correct things for the benefit of others. When we have a mind of compassion, but we are upset at what is going on in our world. It's a very different thing. We're identifying specifically this mind of anger. It is a distortion. It does cause us to have the mind very disturbed. So let's look at the disadvantages first in terms of the detrimental effects that anger has on ourselves. So as I ask you each of these questions, just recall your own experience with this mind of anger when it has arisen. Just recollecting that. So in terms of your mind, when anger was there, how did it make you feel? Were you happy? Were you at peace and in control? Or was it the opposite? When anger arose in your mind, how did your body feel? What was going on physically the times that you've had anger in your mind? What effect does that on your health, on your body? And other physical effects. Has anger ever kept you up at night, kept you unable to sleep, or perhaps even ruined your appetite, or in some way impacted other aspects of your life? And to what extent has it been detrimental in terms of those behaviors? Moreover, when you've had anger in your mind, how was it in terms of your ability to communicate? Were you able to express your thoughts calmly, clearly, effectively? Or was it again the opposite? Was it hard to think, hard to speak, to say exactly what you needed to say? And perhaps out of speaking in that way, through the force of the mind of anger, you've even felt embarrassed afterwards at the things that you said, the way that you communicated to others. Is this so? Have you had that experience with your anger? Has anger caused you to have any loneliness in your life? People shunning you, avoiding you because of that state of mind, not wanting to be around you due to your anger? And what about your experiences with prolonged anger? We see the even more detrimental effects of that. We become very bitter, resentful towards the person who has harmed us, holding on to that anger. And just like that hot coal that we're waiting to throw at the other person, we're burning ourselves. And what is your experience with more prolonged states of anger? And then just a final contemplation on these detrimental effects on ourselves. In general, does anger ever resolve the problem or situation that provoked it? Or does it in fact complicate things and even compound the suffering that you were trying to avoid? Does anger do what it seems to want to do for us, protect us? And in the end, it doesn't protect us at all. It actually creates more harm. So again, examine if this is so. Can you see that in your own experience with anger? Let's also examine the way that our anger affects others unfavorably. So, recalling moments of anger that you've had with other people, How did it make them feel? How did they feel when you got red in the face and upset? And if you went on to express your anger through words or actions, what effect did that have on others who witness it or who are on the receiving end of those words or actions? And what impact has our anger had on others in that way? And perhaps through your actions or words, you've even caused others to engage in an act of retaliating at you. Has your own anger been the starting point for a chain of actions and reactions? And when you've had anger towards someone with whom you have a relationship, has it harmed that relationship? Has it perhaps even caused it to end? A friendship after so many years, suddenly all of that goodwill gone through the force of your anger. And reflect, has this happened to you? Can we see even the possibility of that happening due to our own anger? And finally, has our anger ever caused any physical harm to others or damage their possessions? Again, be honest with yourself, but also gentle with yourself. In answering these questions, we simply are trying to see and make this visible. Understand that we all have patterns that we'd like to abandon. Can see the harm that anger causes to ourselves, the harm that we cause to others through our anger, and see in the end that there are no real benefits to ourselves or others from our mind of anger. And from this, generate your motivation for being here for this afternoon session, wanting to use the time we have together to continue this investigation of this very important topic, how to overcome anger through generating patience. And to do this for yourself, for the benefit that will accrue to you, removing all of these detrimental effects, making ourselves happier mentally, happier physically, and also helping others to be happy and to not suffer through our working on our own anger, and hold that motivation for being here. Hey, so before I go on to some new material, I did want to answer some of the questions that were in the chat box during the end of class that I didn't see before we had our lunch break. So one of them, let me pull this up on my screen here. There's a reference in the reading about indifference. I didn't get a chance to look for that, but anyway, indifference, the question is indifference a positive or negative state of mind, or perhaps just neutral? Can you talk about it in the context of trying to minimize anger that may lead to indifference? Um, Again, we usually use the term indifference in the context of referring to the type of thoughts or attitude that we have towards somebody whose situation we don't necessarily care about. I often, the last workshop I did in December, we were talking about equanimity. And equanimity usually has kind of three flavors. We have the flavor of attachment towards those who are very close to us, who we care about, have great concern for, but we have an attachment to them. We kind of want them to continue to be supporting us in our lives, giving us what we need. So the general kind of reaction to people who are very pleasant in our lives is to have that attachment towards the people who are unpleasant, what we've been talking about a bit this weekend or today, that's the reaction of kind of anger, aversion, because we don't want them in our lives. We want to get them out of our lives. Towards what we call sort of the strangers, the people who we don't have any real karmic connection with yet in this life, we tend to have indifference. So again, I couldn't find exactly where it was in the reading yet. I simply do a search on the document. Maybe I'll do that right now. But the idea is that generally we talk about indifference in that context of it being simply a state of mind that doesn't really care. I mean, it's just not really taking any real interest in the situations of others. So indifference in that context is, I mean, we wouldn't say it's necessarily kind of a real negative state of mind because it doesn't create any real harm to others per se in a direct way, but it does disallow us from fully engaging with others. You know, sometimes people who are in that category of stranger, it sort of breaks through for us, right? We see something on the news about people in a part of the world that are enduring unbelievable suffering. And then we decide, oh, I need to help them. I need to do something about them. That indifference shifts into some level of concern. But for a lot of people, it just stays as indifference. It's kind of a flatline approach to everything. And if it's not somebody that we really care about and that we really want in our lives, nor is it somebody that we want to push out of our lives, we just simply let them go and we don't take any real interest in their lives. So, indifference in relation to anger, again, I'd have to see the exact passage, but I would say that, again, when we do have a mind that is upset and neglecting certainly the welfare of others and even wanting to maybe inflict harm on them, well, then obviously we are also somewhat indifferent to their situation. Because indifference can play out in a variety of roles. I mean, at some level, we're all having some measure of indifference towards even those people perhaps that are very close to us because we don't really fully appreciate everything that is going on for them. We tend to be much more self centered and self focused and not as interested in the individual situations of others. So indifference can play a different role at different times and depending upon where it's manifesting. But again, that's the best that I can do with that question in terms of getting at kind of the role that it might play. It can be, and when the question is it a positive or negative state of mind? I can say it's probably tends to be fairly neutral. I don't know that it's ever really that positive in terms of, I think it's much better, certainly, that we take some interest in others. And of course, it can become negative if that indifference leads to us actually totally neglecting that person's feelings or attitudes or whatever and doing something perhaps that harms them. And then there was another question that had to do with abuse. Um, and I've heard this question before about a kind of abuse in relationships because, again, when we start talking about working with difficulties and not getting angry and upset, and it's a very hard question because everything is really quite situational specific. And I wouldn't want to in any way give anyone any sort of advice that should be construed as you should simply work with your mind and don't worry about being abused. That's not what I'm saying at all. And in cases of abuse, it's often very critical that there be some intervention in that abuse. But again, it's very situational. I remember Venerable Rabina mentioning in one teaching once, and I think some of you were probably there when she said it, that she was working with someone, a woman that was a student of hers, and that woman made the decision to continue living with the person who was abusing her to some degree. I don't know the extent of the abuse. I don't remember Venerable Rabina getting into that. But for whatever reason, even though she had talked to Venerable Rabina a number of times about perhaps exiting the relationship, leaving that, and not continuing to endure any abuse, that she made the determination that it was good for her practice to be around someone who was that way, whether it was just, again, verbal abuse. And sometimes it is, we're at a level of our practice where it can be good to be tested by being around people who push our buttons, who are triggers for us. But that isn't my general advice to people myself. I mean, again, it's very situational, and I'm sure this situation that Venerable Rabina was speaking to was one where she really worked with that person and helped them to define everything very clearly, so that the decision that was made was not something that is in any way kind of in self-hatred or trying to someone inflicting stuff on themselves and being negligent of their own needs. I think we do have to be very careful with all this though, and say it's important that we also don't allow others to engage in abuse from that perspective of a compassion for them. Not only do we not want to be suffering the abuse of others, and it's best to be kind of removed from that if we can, ideally, though there may be times when we can work with that. I think it's dangerous to keep someone in a pattern of inflicting abuse because it perpetuates their patterns, which is not very compassionate towards them either, right? And I'm not saying we can change every person we meet just through our individual actions, but I think we do have to be careful in terms of not um, discounting that side of the equation too, that we also want to have a genuine concern for the well-being of that person who we're in some sort of relationship with. There's some karma to be worked out, perhaps. Again, we'll talk about karma later, but the idea is that a genuine concern for them would also entail not wanting them to perpetuate a cycle of inflicting violence on others, whatever that is, again, verbal, physical violence, what have you. So it's a very difficult question. Generally, rather than answering it in a context of a group like this, I always prefer to talk to people so that I can get a better idea of what's actually going on, so that people don't take any of what I say in an incorrect way. So again, there's different responses based on our own level of practice, based on the severity of the situation, based on other factors that we need to perhaps keep in mind. Um, the other question says, at the beginning, I mentioned that afflictive emotions are not real, but love, for example, is. Can I explain that again? I didn't say necessarily the word real. What I believe I said, and if I said real, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to infer. What I was trying to get across was the validity of something like hatred versus the validity of love. And let me review it again. All of these states of mind that we call afflictions are, another word for them is delusions, because they are deluded. Venerable Rabina often says they're a big fat lie, and they are based on a big fat lie, and as we're going to get into in next Saturday when we get down to the deeper levels of practice, they're based on an erroneous perception of I. We touched on this a little bit earlier today, but everything, all of our reactions that are anger, hatred, and so on, revolve around that. But even in the mind of hatred, when we talk about how the mind of hatred is perceiving the other person, it's fictitious. It is looking at this narrow range of experience that we have, which can be even sometimes just a few moments, right? You have a little altercation with somebody in the parking lot of the Whole Foods or whatever, and as you're leaving, and suddenly that you're steaming because you're thinking that this person who did this, who said this or whatever, is just the biggest jerk you've ever seen, right? And you make up a whole story about them. Well, you don't know, first of all, what even led them to that behavior at that time, because as we're finding out in this investigation, all of our behaviors are the product of causes and conditions, various things coming together, us thinking incorrectly, and then we do things happen to us, and so on. Well, we don't know all of that in that moment. And we are putting a label on that person of being jerk or awful person or evil person or whatever, and painting them entirely with that label. We don't know what they're like when they get home and their dog comes to greet them and thinks they're the greatest person in the world. And, they on the phone to their loved ones and they love them back. We don't see that whole side of that person at all when we have a mind of hatred or disgust or whatever at somebody who's done something to us, again, that can be as short as just a few seconds. And then, moreover, hatred also exaggerates those qualities, it makes them even bigger than what is there. As I mentioned this morning, every one of us has done things that we would regret, that it's painful to even think about them. Think about when you were a jerk to somebody, when you said something that upset somebody. You wouldn't want to be identified as that being the entirety of your being because of those few moments that you were in that state of mind. So why do we do that to others? Why do we pigeonhole them as that and make that even greater, make that even larger than life? The mind of hatred does that, again, at various degrees, depending upon the situation, but it's always working with some level of distortion. If not, we would have great understanding, just like we have understanding towards ourselves. When we have been a jerk, those moments of our lives, however many they are, when we were kind of awful to other people, we know that we're much more than that. We're much better than that. And that generally much nicer and kinder than that. Most of us have these thoughts, right? I'm not saying everyone, but across the board, I would say most of us do. So we give ourselves a lot of leeway, right? We don't identify ourselves as being those particular moments of time, but we do that with the other person. It's a distortion. It's not looking at the whole picture. That's hatred. That's what I mean by it not being valid. It's not that it isn't real. I mean, well, if that's a whole nother discussion about reality, we'll get to next week. But the idea is that hatred isn't grounded in fact, isn't grounded in a valid way of looking at things. We contrast it with the mind of love, though. Love is a mind that is looking at that being, say it's the same being who you had this altercation with in the parking lot at the grocery store. And instead of identifying them as that and labeling them as that and exaggerating it, you look at them as a suffering sentient being who simply wants to be happy. And we even have that phrase that I think comes out in a lot of AA talk about hurt people, hurt people. People who are hurt people. There's always a wound there that is causing people to act in particular ways. Can we change how we look at that person and see them through the lens of love that would genuinely wish them to be happy and to not be suffering and to not continue to be under the sway of all their own delusions? That would be the ideal thing for them, ideal thing for everyone, right? Well, the mind of love is valid in that way. It is not distorting anything. It's looking at them through a lens of understanding their situation clearly and wanting a very positive response, a positive solution to that. It's not distorted. The mind of love has no distortion, no lack of validity. This is, again, as I explained this morning, how we do our work in Buddhism, essentially, to diminish everything that is negative, all those negative tendencies, hatred, anger, jealousy, greed, pride, and to replace them with more healthy states of mind. So it's not just I'm going to suppress all of these delusions and get them down there so they never show. It's rather I'm going to generate positive states of mind that supplant these negative states of mind and that I can become more familiar with. Through the force of my habit, I will eventually be able to sustain those to a limitless degree. We see beings like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and so on who actually have the ability to have this mind of loving kindness and a genuine wish for the welfare of all beings, even in stressful or difficult situations, even when they're dealing with people who have wronged them, or an example of His Holiness, people who of the Chinese government and so on who have wronged the people of Tibet and harmed the people of Tibet. And those individuals who have engaged in those actions, His Holiness has great compassion for them because he sees that they are a product of their causes and conditions and doing certain things that led them to that behavior. Just like in our world and all the people up to mayhem in our world, everyone is doing stuff not aware of creating the causes for their own suffering and destroying their own happiness. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they actually found the true causes of happiness and were able to remove all of their suffering? Those are positive, valid thoughts. So I hope that's clear now. That's, kind of what we were trying to, get as the sort of the basics of our practice is always trying to remove those tendencies that we have that are negative by and replacing them, supplanting them with a more positive emotions that again are grounded in reality. And as His Holiness says, I mentioned this morning, those that are grounded in reality, that are valid, will win over those that are invalid. Just like, truth defeats lies. If we, adhere to the truth, make sure the truth is understood and known, then the lies cease to have any energy because they're not grounded in reality. Those were the three questions. Let me see if there's anything else in the chat box. Okay. Anything else in terms of questions about anything I've talked about so far? Or this meditation, this little reflection that we did? Okay, I have one more little kind of preliminary. I can kind of to summarize what I've done already today. It's mostly preliminary, talking about what is anger, what is patience, what is the mind, how do we work with the mind, and the uh, disadvantages, the detrimental effects of anger. These are kind of setting the stage, and these are sort of reflections that can be done to kind of give you the impetus to do this work. Most of what we're going to talk about for the rest of today and next Saturday is what work do we do? What are the techniques? What are the things that actually help us? Again, meditating on the detrimental effects or the disadvantages of anger is a technique in and of itself. Sometimes that's good enough, right? It often happens with our bodies, even when we go to the doctor and we find out that our blood work is off the charts, right? Get your cholesterol really high or something, and the doctor says, well, this is kind of serious. If you don't attend to this, you're going to have potentially heart disease and blah, 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 blah. Well, then you go, oh, wow, that's the detrimental effect if I continue to eat the way I'm eating and not exercise and whatever. And then you make a decision to change your behavior. So there is something to be said for that being a technique. But nonetheless, that may be somewhat limited and is more of an impetus for us to engage in the other techniques that I want to present to you as part of this course. So let's go to our handout. And again, there's one more little tool that we've already touched on briefly. It has to do with this idea of meditation and mindfulness. I'm going to just read a bit of what Venerable Chodron shares because I think it's really quite useful in giving a instruction on all this. The general strategy for working with anger is first to learn and correctly understand the techniques. That's what we're doing in this workshop, which often involve reframing a situation so that we view it from a new perspective. Then we begin to practice these techniques, first in the peaceful environment of a meditation session or reflection time. This familiarizes our mind with and increases our confidence in a repertoire of alternative ways to look at situations that used to make us angry. The anger would arise because we look at situations through the lens of that inappropriate attention that we talked about, that inappropriate thinking, looking at the person as completely wrong and evil and horrible and da 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 da, building all that up. Training ourselves in these techniques when we are not upset or in a tense situation is important, just as we drive around an empty parking lot in driver's training to get used to the accelerator, the brakes, and steering wheel before going on the highway, so we begin practicing patience in a tranquil environment, not a conflict situation. So hopefully today and next Saturday will be calm enough for you to work with things somewhat here. But then also when you take these practices home, try to find a quiet place where you can sit and reflect on these in regard to past situations and so on. We're going to get some more advice on that shortly from her. But the idea is that don't think that you can immediately, get into a conflict with someone else and they're going to work right there. You need to train, just like a young person who wants to get their driver's license will do some training. They'll get out there with a trainer in a car and learn everything about how the car functions, and then eventually they can become a good driver. So while sitting quietly, she says, we first remember a situation in which we exploded in anger or an event that brings back feelings of hurt or hostility. Then we apply the techniques to it. So it is good to kind of think about something you're comfortable working with. Let me take it off screen for just a moment. Because I think, while there may be some benefit to working with something that brings you a lot of anger, I think that's also a pretty tall order initially to work with something like that. Maybe work with things that are on the lower scale, the kind of annoyances, irritations, things that happen. And maybe it's even someone that you see on a regular basis that kind of annoys you, but you still go see them, you still tolerate them. But just to try to work with that as opposed to somebody who perhaps has done something really horrible to you in your life. That does happen, right? Where we've got that wound that we're carrying around. I encourage you to work with something. Again, remember gentleness. I talked about honesty and gentleness, these being the two guiding principles for our work. I want you to be gentle with yourself in terms of what you choose to work with, because we will hopefully do at least one reflection today before we conclude that will kind of begin this work of examining a particular situation through the lens of an antidote, a different way of thinking, reframing it. So again, choose something that you're comfortable working with, not like the biggest thing that's ever happened to you in your life. There may be some benefit in working with that and getting over it initially, and then maybe everything else looks quite small. But nonetheless, I think it's for developing our skills, it's probably better to start with the small things. So then, towards the right on the screen, about the middle, for example, we might rerun a mental video of the event, but practice thinking differently within it. So this is kind of like putting yourself back in that situation and say, okay, this is what's happening. That person's accosting me or whatever. How would I reframe that at that time? How would I think differently right now that might change my response to what happened? And it says, by viewing the situation from a new perspective in our meditation, we can decrease our anger and then envision ourselves responding to other people differently. This kind of practice not only helps us dissolve past hurt and grudges, it also familiarizes us with techniques that we can apply in a similar situation, in similar situations in the future. This is the one thing that I really always emphasize in terms of our practice. And this is one workshop you're coming to, and many of you go to many other teachings. And I know it's hard to take all the teachings you're getting from all these various sources and integrate them into your practice in your mind. But if you don't do some sort of work with these things don't change. You have to kind of do the work. It's just like, I don't know if there's any examples that come to mind right now, but how do we change? We change by actually practicing, by actually doing something different. If you don't sit and practice in meditation or some form of reflection, sitting quietly and go, how would I actually uh, respond differently in the next time I encounter this situation? Well, then you're never going to have anything to draw from. You'll encounter the next situation, and maybe after the fact, you'll go, "Oh yeah, that's right. I wanted to do something different this time, but I didn't. Maybe I'll do better the next time." Well, that's not good enough. There's a wonderful phrase I actually found. I think it's from Archimedes. The quote, something like, "We don't rise to the level of our aspirations. We sink to the level of our practice or training." It's kind of like, I love this phrase because in Buddhism it makes a lot of sense. You don't like have this, oh, I'm going to be this wonderful bodhisattva warrior and I'm going to be terrific with everybody I meet and it's all going to be peachy keen from here on out. I'm the most compassionate, loving, caring, kind, patient person in the world. And then it happens, right? That's your aspiration. You're not going to rise to that level necessarily. What you're going to do is sink or lower to the level of your practice. You're only going to do as good as you've practiced. I mean, it happens in athletics, right? You can't have somebody who says, "Oh, I'm going to be the best figure skater in the world," and they just keep thinking that way and they never go out and practice figure skating. And then they get to the Olympics or some competition and they can't skate, right? Because they haven't trained. And then we have to do the same thing with regard to our minds. So again, mind training is the name of the game. So anyway, this is what we're being told here by Venerable Children, and I second it completely that we have to do the work. We have to actually, spend some time in reflection, and then we have something to draw from. One key to applying the various techniques, she says, is to focus on our mental attitude and emotions, not on what to say or do. In our American fix-it culture, when we have a conflict, it's all too easy to think, what should I do? We instantly want to fix the problem by changing factors in the external situation. This tendency comes from the ingrained view that the problem exists outside, independent of us. However, as we've seen, and I'm going to read what she says for a moment, the main problem is not what's outside of ourselves, it's what's inside of ourselves, right? This is what we have to change. And we do have a fix-it mentality a lot in our culture. Look at how we're dealing with all of our social problems and things around guns and violence and whatever. We'll get that fixed and then remove the guns, remove this. I'm not saying don't do any of those things, but don't skirt over the issue that what's driving the whole thing is our minds. We have to work on our minds. And so it's the same with regard to our own individual situations of conflict. Don't always think in terms of my sitting down and reflecting is all about trying to find a way to fix the other person or fix the situation. It's about fixing our minds. Yes, we have some compassion and ability to change the situation for the sake of the other person. That's great. But initially, it's about how do I actually alter what I'm thinking so that I'm looking at things more correctly and, moreover, responding more effectively to what's happening. So, and however, she says, as discussed before, since the problem begins with the way our mind interprets and reacts to the situation, the solution begins inside our mind as well. Again, I'm not saying don't do anything on the outside, but the main area of focus is our minds. She continues, she says, therefore, instead of going around in circles trying to decide what to do, for the time being, we should shelve the urgency to fix the problem and focus on transforming our emotions and attitudes. Once that is done, what to say or do isn't so difficult to decide. So again, this is what we really mean by real mind training. And of course, many of you know this practice. Again, I mentioned it this morning called Bojong. It's a more specific practice of training the mind where we work with our problems and difficulties. And the general tendency is not to go fixing the problem immediately, but to fix our minds, change our minds as a way of altering the experience of that problem. Problems are going to happen. We're going to have problems many times in our lives, right? And some people have more problems than others. So it's important that we find techniques to work with this. I added a few quotes to this since one of the times I taught this. I think I may have used these the last time I taught this course. But there's this interesting book called All the Rage. It's a bunch of different articles and teachings by different teachers. And the wonderful teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, who many of you I know have a very close heart feeling towards, a very wonderful teacher in the Vietnamese Buddhist tradition. Um, he has a little article in there called Sowing the Seeds of Love. And I want to share a few of the things that he says because he's really an expert in this whole idea of mindfulness. One wonderful seed in our consciousness, the seed of mindfulness, when manifested, has the capacity of being aware of what is happening in the present moment. If we take one peaceful, happy step, and we know that we are taking a peaceful, happy step, mindfulness is present. Mindfulness is an important agent for our transformation and healing. But our seed of mindfulness has been buried under many layers of forgetfulness and pain for a long time. We are rarely aware that we have eyes that see clearly, a heart and a liver that function well, and a non toothache. We live in forgetfulness, looking for happiness somewhere else, ignoring and crushing the precious elements of happiness that are already in us and around us. If we breathe in and out and see that the tree is there, alive and beautiful, the seed of our mindfulness will be watered and it will grow stronger. He continues, talking about how it needs to grow and develop. Our mindfulness isn't something, that is there from the very beginning. But the idea is, again, we generate mindfulness in the moment, in our meditation, so that we can use that mindfulness throughout our day. It's not, again, just a practice on the cushion. Mindfulness is the factor that keeps us aware of what's going on in our minds. If we have that awareness constantly, we are then going to be much better kind of cultivators of what needs to happen in our minds, the changes we need to make, the ways we need to reframe things. Well, mindfulness is what will allow you to spot when the seeds of anger have started to sprout and we have the tendency moving in that direction, and to stop watering them, to let it kind of wither and go away and again, plant the seeds of patience and loving kindness instead. Now, mindfulness, when we use it in Tibetan Buddhism, we mean a very specific form of kind of non forgetfulness, but it can be directed at anything. Lama Zopa Rinpoche would often say, well, mindfulness is great, but mindfulness of what? You get to say mindfulness like it's some space quality or something that is just there hanging out, mindfulness. It's mindfulness of something. And so we can be mindful of practicing the Buddha's teachings, training consistently and constantly in changing our minds in this way. And removing those negative tendencies through mainly practicing the more positive states of mind. And again, this stuff works because we can see certainly many of our great masters, Thich Nhat Hanh, um, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, so many great Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Thai practitioners of Buddhism. They all have the ability to keep their minds at peace, keep their minds calm in the midst of whatever is happening, right? And we can do that too. You don't have to be, that person, the product of all of that. You just create the causes yourself and you will become that person. So again, I don't want to read everything in this bit. It's really nice pieces there from Thich Nhat Hanh. Let me read this little next part. In this book, All the Rage, I like the title of it. All the Rage sometimes means like everybody's doing it, but everybody's raging, I guess, too, is the joke there to some degree. I'm sorry. I want to read a little bit of this last part. He says, when we start out, the seeds of unhappiness in us are quite strong because we have been watering them every day. When those seeds of unhappiness are strong, even if we do not invite them up from the basement, they will push the door open and barge into the living room. When they enter, it is not at all pleasant, right? This is kind of like that idea of these seeds being a factor that play a role. We have the seeds of this stuff to arise. Just take some little trigger, and suddenly they're coming up from the basement, pushing the door open, barging into our living room. We may try to suppress them and keep them in the basement, but because we have watered them so much, they are strong enough to just show up in the upper level of our consciousness, even without an invitation. So while the pain is in the basement, you can enjoy many refreshing and healing elements of life by producing mindfulness. So again, this is a bit emphasizing what Venerable Chodron was saying too. The time to practice mindfulness and these meditative qualities and everything and understanding how to work with anger is not when everything's painful and got conflict going on. It's when the pain's in the basement, when things are not so prominent. Then, he says, when the pain wants to come upstairs, you can open the living room door and invite your pain to come up. You can smile at it and embrace it with your mindfulness, which has become strong. And again, I would say that in addition to the mindfulness, it's also embracing it with an antidote, with a way of reframing the situation that we then can apply. And that's what we're going to be again going into shortly. So I mentioned this 6 seconds thing earlier when we were talking about a refractory period. I don't need to, I think, read that last quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. But I found this quite interesting because it does give us, I don't want to say it gives us sort of leeway, but it gives us an understanding of why it is so hard, perhaps, to change our minds more immediately when something is going on. Because again, unless you're really highly trained, it's very hard to kind of pull the mind away when the body is already racing along with everything that's happening. So this is from this website that I think Rachel Ryer found this for me when she was helping me. She taught one of the classes the first time I did this some years ago. And she introduced this idea from 6seconds.org. And it says that emotions are absorbed in the body in about 6 seconds. This is what science tells us. Each burst of emotion chemicals, from the time it's produced in the hypothalamus to the time it's completely broken down and absorbed, lasts about 6 seconds. If we're feeling something for longer than 6 seconds, we are at some level choosing to recreate and refuel those feelings. Sometimes that's good. If the tiger is still chasing you, those fear chemicals are helping save your life, right? Sometimes it's not, though, but recognizing what emotions we are feeling, evaluating its purpose relative to our circumstances, and deciding whether to recreate it is what emotional intelligence is all about. Again, this gives us, as I said, a little bit of an understanding of what happens more immediately in the body. Because with anger in particular, and this is what I want to talk about, is how anger, as I said this morning, is one of those emotions that produces very profound and like almost spontaneous changes in the body, right? The adrenaline starts rushing and the heart starts pumping and blood pressure goes up. All this happens. And again, for us to process the emotional receptors, the neurons and what have you, and process that through, as was said in that passage, takes about 6 seconds. It's very hard in those first 6 seconds to do anything that is an appropriate response to what's occurring. Not impossible, but we have to understand that that's what's going on. But moreover, the second point that was made here in that passage, that if we choose, if it's going on beyond those 6 seconds, well, then we're making a concerted effort to refuel that, to kind of keep that going. Again, it gives us kind of an understanding about how we can have the ability to take these experiences in and just let them dissipate of their own accord. Everything else is inappropriate mental attention. Everything else is our continuing to cogitate about whatever occurred, about what the person did and how awful they are and how we didn't deserve it, and blah, 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 blah. All that sort of stuff that feeds the anger, feeds those thoughts. But it's interesting, physiologically, it's just happening within these 6 seconds. And then it's sort of over, it's processed. But mentally, we can cling to that and hold on to it and recycle it, keep it going. I did include in your readings something that I'm not going to talk about very much. It's at the tail end. Maybe I will go back to that and then come back to page 8. It's probably around page 23. Yeah, the appendix has this 6 seconds EQ model, the um, giving you, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these three ideas, but I'm going to use a different term for deflection: awareness, waiting, and deflection. The idea being that we have to have a way of kind of working with that 6 seconds and what comes afterwards to make sure that we respond accordingly. And awareness is this first step. You have to kind of be aware of what is going on. You have to kind of say, okay, label it as what it is. This is an unpleasant sensation coming into my field of experience, and it's inducing this feeling of the blood boiling and whatever, and I just need to be there. And that's calling upon you then to wait, to actually hang out with that feeling. What was it our parents told us when we were young about not doing anything for like 10 seconds or something? Wasn't it just like wait 10 seconds before you react to anything, right? Was a way of kind of keeping us from getting into fights. I think, because there's a tendency when somebody says something about you to immediately put your fists up and go at it, right? Well, just be calm for 10 seconds, wait, and then see how you want to respond more appropriately than reacting with anger. So this is the idea behind what we're going to get into in the next practice, but I want to give you a little more information before we do that. Let me go back to where we were at, page 8. And all right. So what we're going to talk about, and how I'm labeling this whole practice of kind of being aware, waiting, and then reframing or coming from a place of greater response, is the idea of observing anger. This is also kind of a technique, but it's something that can be used probably more easily and readily when we have lesser moments of anger. It's a little bit harder sometimes when we get carried away with the feeling of anger. As said, she indicates, to be sufficiently skilled to apply the techniques for subduing anger in our daily life, we must first familiarize ourselves with them during times of quiet meditation. Just talked about that, right? However, although the word meditation is used, we do not need to sit with legs crossed and closed eyes to familiarize ourselves with the techniques that we're covering, that are from this book, that over this weekend. We can simply lean back in a comfortable chair and reflect. The Buddha taught a variety of types of meditations that subdue anger and cultivate patience. For example, observing the anger, reframing the situation, cultivating opposite emotions such as love and compassion, and generating the wisdom realizing reality. We're going to touch on all of these through today and next Saturday. The meditation of observing our anger, push it up a little bit, involves sitting quietly and instead of paying attention to the storyline behind the anger, simply noting the various physical and mental sensations that arise and pass as the anger flows through us. That's that first step of kind of awareness. Just noting it, being with it, being present with it. We have a tendency to think we have to react immediately. And even in our culture, we think that that's a sign of a responsible person that's going to immediately react to everything. It's just take the time to really become aware of what's going on. It says here, we may note the emotional pain of hurt feelings, disappointment, and unfulfilled expectations. Simply observing these, but not reacting to them by clinging to them or pushing them away, we experience them as they are in the present. In doing so, we watch them arise and cease of their own accord. Again, through that experience of being aware of those and even some waiting, sometimes feelings dissipate on their own. Again, only 6 seconds for the physical side of it to happen. Sometimes we're able to let things go really quite quickly just by being aware of what's going on. It is interesting that that kind of level of mindful awareness has that kind of power. I thought this was an interesting comment too that is worth maybe just introducing. A hospice nurse once commented to venerable children that she has noticed that even if people try, they cannot sustain a negative emotion for very long. Whatever grief, anger, despair, or resentment may arise in the mind, its nature is impermanent and it will pass. If we observe closely, we can even note our emotions and thoughts changing moment by moment. Such mindfulness can be very effective in letting go of negative emotions. So there is some energy it takes to kind of keep the negative emotions going. Maybe we kind of resort to a sort of flat line eventually. It gets really elevated when we have the initial trigger and the reaction to it, but then it does tend to be hard to kind of keep it going. We have to invest a lot in making that happen. Of course, some of us are better at doing that than others, but that's what happens if we actually just let things go, become aware of it, observe it. So the exercise that I put together for you to work with this kind of concept of these 3 steps and how we observe anger is practice number 3. And I want to introduce you to that. And maybe we'll even do that after the break. Maybe, I don't know, would you rather just do it without any instruction? Because then we'll just take our break and we'll come back and do it. Um, Kind of hard with some of these exercises because, again, we don't have anger necessarily in our minds now, but I think we can recollect. Um, Let me just do the little introduction to this, and then I'll go through the actual exercise with all of us as a practice together. So it says here again, we're taking some time to sit quiet and reflect upon one or more of your own past episodes of anger, and ask yourself these questions again that I will go through when we do this practice, in order to first increase your awareness of the sensations that arise as you experience the spectrum of anger. And that's a bit of that 6 second stuff, but it's just kind of being aware of not just physically, but even mentally what's going on. What is happening? Try to be aware of it rather than the subjective identification with it, which, as I said earlier today, is where we get into trouble. We become the anger in a sense, and the anger is us. Rather than that, we're going to simply observe, increase our awareness. The second step, number 2, develop the ability to wait, to respond appropriately. Waiting is such a skill, and we don't do it often enough, right? As I said, in our culture, we have this idea that everything has to be kind of rapid fire, that we always have to be immediately ready to do this and to do that. Waiting is important. I don't know why I thought of this, but I thought of a comment that I think it was Debussy, Claude Debussy, the composer, who talked about how music is the space between the notes. And there's something true about like kind of in terms of our practice, the practice is kind of the space between the thoughts, perhaps, or the ability to kind of just allow some space to be there and not immediately have these impulses to do this and that, but to kind of give some weight to silence, to space, to waiting. And I don't think culturally we do this so much. We're just really and as was said earlier, a fix it kind of culture. We want to always get in there and immediately say what needs to be done and do this and do that and whatever. And the whole practice of just kind of being quietly waiting, quietly just being with presence for a while so we can respond appropriately. Again, and that does allow all the sort of emotional stuff to dissipate to some degree so that then it's not quite as heated. Our response is not going to be that irrational as what anger usually is. Okay. Then we have a third step, which again, in that practice, I think it was called what I have it here. Where is it? Come on. And that 6 seconds thing, it was called deflection. Deflection, I didn't really like the word deflection. I don't know. It sounds kind of strange. You're deflecting that emotion or something. Rather, I like the idea again of reframing. So, how I'm kind of working with this is the third step being explore the potential to reframe the situation through changing your thoughts at that time. Remember, anger is a thought. You're just going to have a different thought. Then, when you encounter something that could trigger your anger, notice when you are able to hold that awareness of what's happening, to then wait to respond rather than habitually reacting, and also to eventually consider that it's possible to reframe your thoughts so you can consequently respond with more beneficial words and actions. And I would say that first two tend to be a little bit more important in some regard initially, because my hope is through the time we spend in these 2 days together that you at least have the ability to not be so reactive to situations that would normally cause anger. If you can reframe them in a way that produces an even more positive response, that's kind of icing on the cake, right? And that's where we're ideally wanting to be. But the initial step is stop stepping in it again. Stop doing the thing that you've always been doing, as that just keeps increasing the habit. And that doesn't allow the space for you to do anything different then, right? So you really want to make sure that you are at least doing the first two steps, becoming aware of what's going on, and then waiting, not being so quick to say or do what we think needs to be done. Any questions before we take a little break? And then when we come back, we'll do this little reflection together and hope you'll find it of some benefit. Anything online? Don't see anything in the chat box. All right, let's take 5 minutes. So I've got about 32 minutes after the hour, so somewhere around there, 37 minutes, about 5 minutes just to take a stretch break, and then we'll do this meditation. Maybe just check in since folks are still coming in online as well. Were there any other questions on anything so far? All right. Um, let's just wait another minute or so, see if some of the screens come back on online, as well as some folks here coming back into the Gompa. So, hi, Sheila. All right. Okay, so again, what we're going to do with this little exercise is to, first of all, recall an episode, a time when you did have um, some sort of arisal of anger. And again, it's not to fully go back and recreate the whole situation. It's just to be able to apply these three ideas of sort of, again, becoming aware as best as you can, projecting yourself back into that past experience of what was going on, you know, what was happening, the sensations that were arising, and so on. Secondly, to then develop the ability to see what would it be like to wait, to sort of be with that for some period of time until you feel better prepared to be able to respond accordingly. And then, of course, to work with this idea of reframing. And I'll guide you in some questions to go through those three steps. So let's just begin by just getting back in touch with the breath. So we'll just spend a couple of minutes kind of focusing on the breath, being aware of the inhalation, the exhalation, however you choose to work with the breath, and trying to calm the mind a bit before we begin to investigate this episode. So we'll do that now. So, as I said earlier, let's work with something you're comfortable with in terms of an episode of anger. Just spend a minute or so to look back on your past life and choose one moment that, again, feels like it'd be good to investigate, something that isn't too painful or difficult for you, but yet can be clearly identified as an episode of anger. We'll work first with increasing our habit of awareness, being aware of what's going on. So, in recalling that episode, when it was happening, when did you first recognize that anger was being triggered? Did you have that recognition in the midst of that experience? If so, when? And to the best of your recollection, what sensations occurred at that time? Physical, mental sensations? What was going on? And try to put yourself back in that episode to the best of your ability. What were the physical and mental sensations occurring, arising? And can you detect with more precision how the feelings of hurt and anger changed throughout that episode? They weren't probably a constant from the beginning to the end. How did they change? Physically, mentally? What was going on in terms of a more precise measurement of their strength, their weakness? And then, lastly, in terms of awareness, at any point during the episode, was there also present a desire to change your mind or to do something different? Did that impulse arise, that thought? Again, whether it did or not, it's okay. Just with honesty, gentleness, look at your own experience. Let's look at a few questions that might help us to generate a wish to develop this habit of waiting the second of these three steps. First of all, what would it have been like for you to step back, breathe, and simply wait to respond to your feelings? Just entertain that idea. What would have been like? What would the experience have been like if you'd chosen to do that? Is there anything that you've learned, any technique, maybe even during today, that you would have found useful to inspire you at that time, to avoid your more immediate reaction and to wait before responding in that situation? And we're just trying to find the things that will help us, inspire us, were we to meet a situation like that again in the future. What would inspire you to wait? And the third practice that we want to be able to adopt, not just being aware and waiting, but also reframing. So let's explore the potential for this to happen, to develop that habit. First of all, can you see that in that episode, you did have the potential to choose to see things differently or to change your response? Can we see that that is a possibility? Might not have felt like it at the time, might not have even entered our minds, but the potential is there, the possibility. And looking back on that episode, how could you reframe things now so that your anger might be lessened or even avoided? And take a minute or so to do this. We haven't talked extensively, but already I'm sure you have some ideas. How would you look at that situation in retrospect to diminish the anger? How would you reframe it? Just do that. Think about that. And lastly, although we might not have had that idea or success at the particular episode that we're recalling, have there been other occasions where you actually have been able to change your thoughts when anger began to arise? And what happened when you did that? What did you think? How did you act on the basis of different thoughts? And give yourself some credit for the times where perhaps you have been practicing already, changing your thoughts, reframing. And what happened then? And before we conclude this, just see what lessons were learned through just this brief investigation of these three: awareness, waiting, reframing, and what the possibility is by using these to observe our anger. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll continue. So any comments about those 3 steps? I hope I explained them well enough in advance to work with these. This again is being able to apply some level of mindful awareness to see what's going on, to really pay attention. So we're on autopilot a good portion of our lives, right? And that's why we tend to step in it so many times, is because we don't even think about what's going on. We aren't even aware of what's going on. We're already immersed in it before we have that awareness. Kind of like me again, driving in the Bay Area and suddenly going, oh, wow, I just did it again. You know? So we have to have that awareness. And then, of course, some ability to wait, to not respond or react immediately. And then, as we're going to discuss more and more, how do we actually reframe things? Catherine, you'd like to share something? Hope we have you all hooked up on the system here. I think we do. Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Well, it just really brought home to me how selfish anger is.
Mm.
And my particular example was, I was driving and sometimes when I'm driving, I'm the best damn driver on the road, right? And so, yeah, it brought that back to me that it's very selfish of me to drive with that attitude. And yeah, I guess
Right.
I was kind of, in awe at that. So that's it.
Thank you for sharing that, Catherine. That's I appreciate your honesty, because yes, it is. We do start seeing things about ourselves when we do these sorts of investigations, and how much we are doing things that are totally contrary. And we just have to keep working with it again. And I don't, again, by this idea of working with being selfish and that, um, remember, I mean, His Holiness even uses this phrase, there are ways of being wisely selfish, which is actually to tend to yourself in the best way is to tend to others in the best way, to make sure that we are as conscious and aware of the needs of others. And that can be very self-satisfying, right? Because we feel good. We were talking about this even a little bit during the break about how the ideal way that we want to think about our future experiences and what we're aiming for is to have that kind of good feeling that we have when we do something for others, when we feel very selfless, and trying to nurture and cultivate that. So we'll get into this more next Saturday when we talk about some of the reframing that can be done around having genuine concern for the other person when we're in a situation where we would normally have anger arise. Anything else anyone want to share? Thank you so much for in your honesty and sharing that. I mean, this is really the goal for all of our practices. What Catherine was sharing is to become more honest with ourselves and really be able to see what is going on. We have a tendency, and it's all of our ego stuff, of just glossing over our own faults and always picking up on the faults of other people, right? We're really good at that. But we have to begin to see kind of what's going on in our own little workshop here, our own little minds. All right, let's carry on a little bit then and do some additional work with this next set of readings and exercises. From here on out, as I said, we're mostly going to be looking at what are the techniques that we can actually utilize. That's third step, where if once we've waited, then we kind of see, oh, okay, I want to introduce something that will help me to not have anger and instead have more valid and affirming thoughts. This second part, I put a lot of different things in here. This is, let me actually go back to our outline. So in our outline, we've already gone through the first part of investigating anger and patience this morning. We began looking at this disadvantages of anger. This is a meditation practice in and of itself that we started with this afternoon. And then the technique of observing anger that we just did. Everything else that we have from here on out, which gets into these second through this fifth level of practice, is really where we are looking at truths that we can come to see for ourselves, truths that the Buddha taught, but the Buddha didn't just teach them because they're true for him and no one else. He taught them because they are true in reality, and it's up to us to see if that truth is also something we can find, that we can rely upon. In this second level of practice, we're going to be looking at practice number 4 of the 7 practices I've put together for you. The kind of topics that we're looking at within this is recollecting and accepting the nature of things. By this, we don't mean the deeper nature of things. That's the last one, the most complicated practice, perhaps. We're talking about just how things are in our world in a conventional sense. Secondly, recognizing that our control of situations is somewhat limited. I think when we are reacting from a place of anger, often we think that we can take charge of it and make it be whatever we want it to be. But oftentimes we don't have that control. I mean, things in this world are really quite complex, a lot of interrelated factors. So these are the two main things we're going to look at in regard to this idea of having a kind of a deeper understanding of how things are. Okay. So, regarding the acceptance of situations, I've got a passage here from Venerable Chodron again. Underneath our anger, we often find a refusal to accept the reality of a situation and a feeling of powerlessness in its face. And that's what often prompts us to try to take control and think that we have control because we don't like what's happening and we want to do something to change it. These feelings are related because the confusion that arises from fighting the reality of an event makes us feel helpless and unable to influence it. Once we accept what is happening, we can determine more clearly the parameters of possible action and feel empowered to act. Now, this is the idea of acceptance. I actually found it quite interesting. I've taught on this before, both here at Thupten Norberling, a number of other Buddhist centers. I've taught on what are called the 8 pillars of joy that His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu came up with in their meeting in Dharamsala some years back. And one of them is acceptance. Acceptance is actually produces a lot of joy because once we actually accept how things are, there's no longer that resistance. So much of our pain comes from the resistance, from like pushing back on, thinking this can't be how they're supposed to be. It's got to be different. It's got to be something else, right? And that resistance doesn't produce any joyous feelings. The acceptance produces joy. Being able to say, that's how it is. And then we work with it. As we're going to see, there's that wonderful quote from Shanti Deva that gives us exactly how to work with it. Once we have come to some acceptance that the situation's actually happening, then we are in a much different vantage point, a much different place to actually work with it. As it says there, once we accept what is happening, we can determine more clearly the parameters of possible action and feel empowered to act. Often we become angry because we think that someone, again, I don't try not to use that word become angry, but rather often we have anger because we think that someone shouldn't think, do, or say what they do, what they are, or things shouldn't happen the way that they are. I say that right, shouldn't think, do, or say what they are, or that things shouldn't happen the way that they are. It's kind of a mouthful of words. Again, we do have that idea that this shouldn't be happening, right? My life is supposed to go differently. My day was supposed to go differently. This already shows the extent to which we have an expectation that everything is supposed to be hunky-dory, right? Everything's supposed to be exactly how we want it to be. That's like setting ourselves up. What was that phrase? Expectations are premeditated resentments. You know, it's like once we have an expectation, well, then we're just setting ourselves up to have resentment eventually and disappointment because things don't go the way that we want them to, right? So she continues, in other words, our mind does not accept the reality of whatever is happening and wants it to be different. We may develop many reasons why things should be different, but that doesn't change the reality of what they are, right? Oh, it should be different. The things should be happening differently in this country on a political landscape or whatever. Things should be happening, differently in my family life or whatever. All those things we can entertain the idea of, but it doesn't change the reality of what they are. Some people think that acceptance means not trying to change the situation and fear that such an attitude could be used to support abuse or oppression. However, this is not the case. Acceptance simply means fully accepting that what is happening now is indeed happening, even if we do not like what it is. We stop fighting the reality of the present moment and let go of our anger. Nevertheless, we can still aspire and work towards improving the situation in the future. In fact, acceptance of the present enables us to think more clearly about effective means for influencing what occurs in the future. If you can't really accept what's going on now, how can you even envision what needs to happen to move forward? This is where that advice from the great Indian sage, Indian Buddhist Shantideva comes. This is from his sixth chapter on patience, verse 10. Why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? And what is the use of being unhappy about something if it cannot be remedied? So acceptance precedes both of those conclusions, right? We have to accept that what is going on is what's happening. This is what's happening in my life. And I have that particular situation with this person or whatever. I have to accept it for what it is. Then I go through a little kind of investigation. Is it something I can do something about? Well, if you think that you can change that person into something that they aren't, you might think again, because that's really that's probably the hardest thing that we can do is to get someone else to change into who we want them to be, right? You know, we should have learned that by now. That's probably not a possibility, but maybe we can change some things that allow for them to be more content in what's going on and whatever. And, there are always those possibilities of things that we might look at with good motivation and of a good nature that will actually change things positively. I'm not saying, getting rid of them, voting them off the island is the thing to do. What is the thing to do is to actually see, are there some things that will have an effect upon the situation favorably by changing those factors? If it cannot change, though, if things cannot change, if we really feel like we're up against, a rock and a hard place and there's nothing we can do, well, then our getting bent out of shape and angry and upset doesn't make any sense, right? Because there's no point in it. We have to learn to really have a deeper acceptance of reality and to just say, well, this is the way this person is for now. I can't do anything in my limited ability to help them to be any different. I have to learn to accept them for who they are. I can't change them, can't do anything different. I have to find deeper peace in my own mind, a deeper calm that is not precipitated on them meeting my expectations, because they're not going to meet my expectations. So I know it's very simplistic. It's a bit in the same vein, actually, as the Serenity Prayer, right? That many of you know. Grant me the courage to change the things I can, the strength to endure the things I cannot. I'm changing the word slightly, and then the wisdom to know the difference. It's a very similar thought, right? There are certain things we can change, and we need the courage and the ability to do that. And by all means, as I was referring to earlier, if we have this form of anger or um, kind of feeling of injustice of what's going on in our world that we're upset about, well, do what you can to change those things. Do it with a clear mind. Do it with a strong, motivation of the best benefit for all. But, those things that we cannot change, we have to find the sort of strength and ability to be with those, kind of endure those. Those are a part of life. We often have things that we absolutely cannot change. And certainly the Buddha taught many of them as realities that we need to reflect on and be aware of constantly, such as our own deaths, our own impermanence. You cannot change the fact that you're going to die. You can change what you do until then and how you are better prepared for that reality. That's what we can work on. And generally, and we find in some things we can't change this, but we can change other factors. The one thing we can always change is our minds. Of course, that goes without saying in the Buddha's teachings. But so this is the idea again of trying to develop some awareness of what's going on and what it sort of category it falls into. But we have to learn to accept it one way or another as the starting point for either changing it or coming to a deeper place of acceptance. Then she says, if we face an unpleasant situation and can change it, well, why get angry? We can act and either extricate ourselves or improve the situation. On the other hand, if we cannot alter the situation, why get angry? It's futile. There's nothing effective we can do. So we are better off relaxing. Becoming agitated only compounds our suffering. I have to say that this quote from Shantideva is one of His Holiness's favorite quotes. I think he uses it in lectures very, very frequently because it is really quite profound, but so practical. But it's hard. I'm not saying we can And once more, don't feel like you can dole out this medicine to anyone who you see, because we first have to learn to use it on ourselves, and certainly recognize that other people may be very limited in their ability to work with this type of advice. The most important thing is to start with ourselves. All right. So let's see, where do I want to stop on that? Um, let's look at the exercise. I'm not going to go have time again to go through all of these exercises, these practices. I would encourage you again, as we're going through these, if over the next week, if you would like to work at least with this first one. This is exercise or practice number 4, accepting the nature of things. There are many different parts of this. We just went through the first one. And the idea here, as it says in the introduction, is when you experience something that gets you upset, ask yourself the following questions to increase your acceptance of the nature of things and see if it has an effect on diminishing your reaction of anger. So, again, this is that third step in that meditation we just did on observing anger. We first become aware, kind of tune in to, oh, this is happening. Here's these sensations arising. That may already diminish some of the effect of that situation and diminish the anger. Secondly, wait. Be kind of present with it and get your composure so that you can then investigate. And this would be one of the techniques you might use, is to examine the reality of the situation. First, can you accept the reality of the event and see clearly what is happening? Seeing clearly what is happening is maybe a tall order sometimes because we don't know everything that is happening. We can at least see it from our point of view and understand what is going on. What is the situation that's happening? What is it that I'm hearing and that I'm thinking about that's causing me to begin to move in the pathway of anger? And again, this is something, the situation, something that I can do something about. As it says in number 2, is it something that you can actually change? If so, what might you do to facilitate that change rather than getting stuck with anger or frustration? I was talking earlier about kind of putting down to some degree our fix it society and how we tend to just immediately want to go to fix it situations. But of course, we do need to often sit back and wait and see what comes up and investigate. And sometimes we don't even know what needs to happen to change, but we have an understanding that change can occur. And at that time, it might even be better to invite in other people's opinions about what needs to change, especially if we are dealing with a situation where it entails, other people's well-being and what have you, rather than unilaterally saying, "I know how it's going to be better. I'll do this," and then our lack of awareness of other people, we might actually do something that's worse for the situation. So don't always, this advice, don't think that it means that you immediately go in and make that change. You just spend some time thinking about, well, this is something that could change. I could actually do something with that situation. Instead of having that anger, it makes more sense for me to put energy into trying to find that solution, trying to help resolve things. The other side of the question, of course, is this something that I can't do anything about? Is this something that actually it's futile for me to try to change the situation? If it's something you cannot change, can you see the uselessness in becoming agitated and simply let it go by relaxing the mind, coming again to a deeper place of acceptance that this is the reality of what's going on? And we will have some situations where that is kind of the case, where the only thing we can do is change our own minds. And I'm not saying that that isn't some some action. It is an action, but in terms of the situation, we can't put energy into the situation because it's not going to change. At least nothing that we can change, maybe even unilaterally. The next topic that we're going to go into, we'll go to the readings, is recalling change and the impermanence of things. Of course, this is why we can actually make changes in situations where that's a possibility. But the idea here is that we want to embrace the concept that things do naturally change often. Even with situations that can't be changed in the moment, something will perhaps shift and then it becomes something else. Or, over time, it even becomes something very different. And we'll look at that concept. So let me see if I can finish this section before we conclude today. Venerable Chodron says, although change is universal, we typically know this only intellectually. We kind of all get that everything's changing, but we cling to the exact opposite. In the recesses of our mind, she says, we grasp at what we call permanence, a sort of unchanging nature. Permanence doesn't mean that everything is eternal. It means that things don't change, that we kind of want to believe and grasp at this concept that they don't change, even though they do change all the time. They're impermanent. We grasp at permanence and predictability and feel that our trust has been betrayed when change that we did not predict and sanction happens. For example, we understand that our relationships are impermanent by their very nature, right? Everything that arises also changes. Thus, from the very beginning, any relationship by its nature is bound to change. There's no way around this. Yet, unless we deeply accept this, we will be surprised when it does so, right? Be like, where did that come from? I mean, I find it quite interesting that actually um, many people in this world are able to couple up if they choose to couple with someone and actually make it through many, many years of being together when both of those individuals are changing and the relationship is changing, right? Because it's hard. It's hard dealing with change because we want them to stay the way that they were when we fell in love with them, right? Or when we decided that that was the relationship we wanted. But people change. It's really quite understandable that people will change so much that they need to diverge in order for them to have the peace of mind to be able to continue that change. So, again, kind of condoning all of that disruption in relationships. But if people had the understanding, they would be totally fine with it. Okay, well, when I married you or decided I was going to live with you, you were like this. And now I see that you changed, and perhaps it's time for us to go our separate ways and be fine. And be like, okay, that sounds good to me too. I've changed a lot too. Let's go for it. But we have a society that clings to this concept that people are supposed to just kind of be this constant, unchanging thing. But everyone changes, everything changes. All right, let's stop giving all my commentary on these things. What was that? Don's book on divorce, How to Destroy Your Relationship in 3 Easy Steps. Um, um, so this is a little bit from Venerable Choden, another book that she has, Open Heart, Clear Mind. It's actually a book that I really like to give to beginners that are curious about Tibetan Buddhism because it has a lot of the teachings. It's put in it together in a very nice sort of Western way. But she says the meditation on impermanence involves recollecting that all the people, objects, and situations change each moment. They don't stay the same. Remembering impermanence helps us to avoid exaggerating the importance of what happens to us. For example, if we're attached to our new car and are angry because someone dented it, we can think, this car is always changing. It won't last forever. Since the day it was made, it's been deteriorating. I can enjoy it while it's here, but I don't need to be upset when it's dented, for the nature of the car is that it changes. Right? It's very simple to say, but it's not so easy sometimes when things happen that are more severe in terms of changes in our life. Again, we did just talk about that whole idea of, well, if it's something you can change, don't get upset, just change it. And if it's something that can't change, well, then you should just accept it. What do you think? But everything changes anyway. Well, to some degree, things do change. It's just the idea is, are you capable of changing the things? Is there something that you can do? Everything changes to some degree with time. And if we look back on some event that happened to us that was very hurtful earlier in our life, it feels very different now, perhaps, and again, depending on what we've done with that situation. But this is just the nature of things. Time and impermanence do have an effect on things over spaces of duration of periods, whatever is going on, years, months, uh, lifetimes. So we have to recognize that this is the nature of things to actually change in some manner, given that reality, and do the meditation on impermanence. The last point that I want to share here from this is something that I thought was really quite interesting from a practicing emotional intelligence, Joshua Friedman. Um, and emotional intelligence, most of you know this term, the idea being that we have a sort of IQ that is our intelligence quotient that most of society seems to be based on. We need that EQ, that emotional quotient that is really dictating more our ability to be emotionally sensitive and aware and intelligent in terms of our emotions. Daniel Goleman wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence. It's really quite good. He says, try creating a 5-year flashback. Imagine you're looking back on this moment from 5 years in the future. What are the options your future self can see? Which of those options will contribute to something that still matters in 5 years? By practicing this reflection, you'll build the muscle of taking perspective because impermanence, of course, means that things will change. And in 5 years, this will be a very different situation in terms of looking back on it than what it feels like in the freshness of the now, the present, right? You'll find that you're better able to recognize the small stuff and let it go. This will give you space to focus your energy and attention on what's most important to you and to our shared future, right? So that you actually make more conscious choices. So I think it's a really useful exercise. I mean, think about when you're having somebody say you're back in that parking lot and somebody is accosting you with whatever. Maybe they didn't like the way you parked your car because it was at a little bit of an angle and they had a hard time getting in or something. And they accost you and they put you down because you're such a lousy driver and blah, 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 blah. In 5 years, is that going to matter? I mean, some random encounter with somebody in a parking lot that, criticized your driving. In the moment, it feels like, how dare you say this to me? Da, da, da. Or maybe we get super apologetic and feel like really guilty and horrible and awful and whatever. But, if the anger seed is coming up, well, then we're just going to be pushing back against that. What are the effects of that? And wouldn't we be much better off just saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to park that way. I was in a hurry, blah, 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 blah," whatever excuses we feel we need to make. And we just say, "I'll be more mindful of that in the future. Thank you for pointing that out to me." We could say that, right? Sounds weird to put it forward like that, but we don't usually say that. We say, "Well, you're a lousy driver. Or what are you doing?" Blah, 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 blah. We put the onus on them. So again, think back in 5 years, when you look back, projecting yourself 5 years in the future, looking back on that situation. Is it so important that you got your, kind of forced yourself on the other person, made your point so clear to them, whatever you felt you needed to do to defend yourself? We do that all the time, and these things don't really matter. I was going to share the little chicken and duck story from Ajahn Chah's book called "Who Left This Who Left This Truckload of Dung" or something. Who do you know this book? Whose truckload of dung is this, kind of the idea? Anyway, the story of the chicken and the duck is like this couple's walking along and suddenly, they're having a nice kind of peaceful time together, really enjoying being out in nature. And suddenly they hear quack, quack. And the one person says, "Oh, it's a duck." The other one says, "No, it's a chicken." You know, "No, I'm pretty sure that's a duck. I heard a quack, quack. That's a duck." And the other one says, "Well, no, I'm sure it was a chicken. It's no duck. I'm sure that's a chicken." And they get into this animated like argument and end up even saying hurtful things to each other. Then finally, one of them says, "Oh, no, 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 it's a chicken. It's a chicken. I'm sure it's a chicken. You were right all along." And then they kind of walk happily, because the one person has finally given in to the other, even though it's a quack quack. It's not a cluck cluck. It's a quack quack. And so, what does it take for us to get to that place where we just say, "Oh, you're right," because in the end, it doesn't frickin' matter if it's a duck or a chicken. Sorry to be so blunt, but we get so much energy around kind of investing in these sorts of things, feeling like we need to be right, kind of asserting our superior position. Of course, this is a lot of pride and stuff that plays into this. It's not just anger at that time, it's really coming from so many other emotions that are causing us to feel defensive. Like, how dare they do this to me? This is not, they're wrong, I'm right. It's a bit of what Tipton Children said earlier, right? I'm right, you're wrong, and you need to change. You need to know that that's a duck regardless. It's a duck inside and out. You're not going to convince me it's not a duck. Instead, we can just say, okay, it's not a duck. Who cares? I'd say we have a lot of chicken and duck stuff that goes on in most relationships, right? Friendships, most intimate relationships, where people just get kind of tangled up in stuff that really doesn't matter so much. That's the nature of impermanence, is that everything changes over time. A lot of the things that we felt so passionate about earlier on in our lives don't matter as much now. Things that we maybe even harmed other people on the basis of our thoughts and attitudes at that time. Okay, so let's take a look before we conclude today at the questions involved in this, and maybe we'll start with this or the other one when we uh, resume next Saturday. This is going to the practice. This is practice 4, but part B. All right. At this moment, when again you're recalling a particular time of something coming in, and you do this with recollection on the cushion, but then you try to apply this when something's actually happening. Maybe on your way home today, I hope it doesn't. Maybe something will happen, and you can actually bring these thoughts to mind. At this moment, are you being taken off guard because of not being aware of the fact that everything changes and that your expectations to the contrary aren't in line with reality? And expectations plays a big role in this. We expect that everything is going to go the way we want it to go, but things change. There are traffic jams, there are accidents, there are, all these things that can interrupt our day, and suddenly, we have to deal with that reality. Secondly, in terms of what you are experiencing and how you are feeling, are you exaggerating the importance of what is happening to you at this moment? Are you making a mountain out of a molehill, as they say? Because we do a lot of that too. And that is belied again by this 5-year flashback. Go forward 5 years. The third question, does it help lessen your anger by seeing that the situation is going to change and that in hours, days, months, or years, it might even seem quite insignificant? Might even be something that you won't even remember. Oh, that person in the parking lot, I don't remember that, just happened, but it's not something I even care about. Well, why was I so passionate in the moment and needing to be angry and upset at that person? So again, impermanence and change is a very profound topic. I'm probably not doing it justice today because the Buddha says, of course, we have subtler levels of change that are going on all the time. Our bodies are changing, the world is changing, everything in the physical world certainly is changing momentarily, but our minds are also in a constant state of flux. But then there's also grosser forms of impermanence. There is even this thought that, when we recognize the reality of death, that it does put things in perspective too. Especially if you think, well, okay, in this moment, if I'm choosing to have anger arise in response to that person accosting me in the parking lot, it could be my last moment. I mean, people have died in incidents of road rage, as simple as that. I remember the first incident I heard about in the Bay Area was somebody down in San Mateo, two people who were pulling into the parking lot of a convenience store. And one thought it was theirs first, and the other one thought it was theirs. And as soon as the one car pulled in front of the other, they got into an argument, and one person went into the glove compartment, boom, shot the other person. You can die with that mind. And is a parking spot at the convenience store that important in the end? So you park a little further away and walk a few more feet. You know, in retrospect, it would be horrific if we were to lose our lives on the sake of something so insignificant. And I even had an incident. I'll be honest and somewhat gentle with myself, I hope. I was in San Francisco going up to the Safeway that was at the top of the one hill. I think it was Diamond Heights. Anyway, can't remember. And I was coming out of it. It was a pretty early on a Saturday morning. And I got to a stop sign, and there was this other car that pulled to the stop sign from its direction after me. So I immediately started to take off, but he took off in front of me, like, and immediately made this turn. So he's in front of me at this point. We're going along like this. And I decided I was going to get in front of him because it was not right that he did this. I mean, can you imagine? It's so stupid, right? In retrospect. So I went around him and tried to get to the, in front of him and everything. And he got very threatening. And he even told me when we were at another stoplight or whatever next to each other. He said, I've got a gun in here and I could shoot you for being such a jerk or whatever. He didn't use those words. And I was like so embarrassed and so frightened, of course, as well. And managed to get out of it. I think I made a left-hand turn where I really wasn't planning to go, just to get off the road and be out of the situation. I was like, this is real stuff, folks. I mean, and all it takes is just one little moment of thinking, they shouldn't have done that to me, right? That's it. So again, it's maybe another type of anger we're talking about here, but in terms of these examples, but from the perspective of change and impermanence, when I look back on that, again, it's pretty insignificant. In the moment, you feel such heat and animosity and whatever, and you feel totally justified in what you're doing, but it's not. It's pointless. It has no real significance in the end, other than becoming a story for me to tell when I'm teaching on anger. So that was it. But so, we all have our moments. I haven't had a moment like that since then because it really kind of scared me. And I think that, again, people who've been in road rage incidents where they've been very close to having something like that happen, it makes you think twice about doing something. You're just like, okay, they can go ahead, be my guest. You don't have to be so assertive. So let everybody go. Anyway, any final questions before we conclude today or comments? So what I would encourage you to do over the next week, review what I've covered. You're certainly welcome to read ahead. There's no problem with that. But you've got, again, quite a few pages of reading there that we did go through and some of which I didn't cover in its entirety. And just try to work with whatever feels kind of appropriate. You can sort of sample things and you'll have more to sample after next Saturday because I'll have gone through the remaining practices. But the idea is just try these on to see how they work for you, first in a meditative setting, whether you're sitting on a chair or whatever, sitting in a formal meditation posture. Try to reflect on them using past situations that you've encountered, or maybe even things that are ongoing, like somebody, again, that you have in a relationship with, in family or in workplace or whatever, that you want to kind of bring that to your experience with them and see what effect it has. Because not everybody's going to find each of these techniques to be as effective for them as perhaps other ones are. So we've all got different dispositions. All right. Thank you all for your attention today. Let's do some dedication prayers and kind of conclude things. So, and we have this first dedication prayer, which is based on our motivation, which we, again, didn't have it quite focused on this idea of becoming a Buddha for all beings, at least so that the work that we do on ourselves through the time we've had today in trying to diminish our own patterns of anger, that this becomes the cause for us to be able to help others to remove their anger and to realize their full potential. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then this mind of bodhicitta, that is, we'll talk about this more next Saturday, but it's this compassionate wish to benefit all beings through all of our actions. We want that mind to grow and develop so that we become these radiant beings who are, completely consumed with the welfare of others. We want that bodhicitta to grow and develop in our own hearts and to never decline. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then we like to do some prayers for our precious teachers. We're going to recite the long life prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, kind of create the causes from our side to continue to have his presence in this world for as long as possible so that we and others can benefit from that. As we recite that verse, also think that we're creating the causes for all other teachers, gurus, lamas, to continue to be in this world. The wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then, as most of you know, maybe all of you know, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, passed away in April of last year. Strong prayers for his presence to return in the form of another being that we can learn from and practice with and so on. So we're going to recite these verses that are a kind of request, a strong request, a prayer for the very swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Fearless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage master, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings, Through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. And I'd like to tack onto the end a dedication that we can all do for those beings that are close to us, that we're holding in our hearts. They may be beings that we know, or even places in the world right now where we're greatly moved by what's happening. The suffering that's being experienced in the Gaza Strip, for example, or in Ukraine, or so many other parts of the world. Whatever it is that moves you, individuals or areas where there are these great sufferings, send this positive energy out to these beings in particular. We see their suffering and it moves us. It causes us to have compassion for them. So send this energy to them so they can experience an immediate removal of all their suffering. And moreover, ripen into the complete causes that they need in order to accomplish their greatest welfare, their greatest potential. And really feel that you want this for these beings in particular. And then enlarge this. And may this be so for all beings. May they be free of all suffering and find all the causes that lead to perfect happiness. Thank you all for your attention and participation in today. And again, we'll meet again next Saturday at the same times, and look forward to hearing what questions you have from practicing over the next week. But again, feel free to read ahead if you'd like to, because there's some interesting stuff and then might get more questions, what have you. But all right, everyone, be well. Thank you. Thank you, Venerable Dundrup, and thank you, Shayla, for hosting online.